Holy smokes, prices of Sega games are going through the roof. And sure, Sega games have always been relatively expensive, but I want to talk about why that is. So we're going to be talking about the three most popular Sega consoles that I see retro game collectors going after nowadays, which would be the Sega Genesis, and kind of as an extension of that, the Sega CD, the Sega Saturn, and the Sega Dreamcast, which sure enough are the three most recent Sega consoles as well. There's also stuff like the Sega Game Gear and Sega Master System, but I just don't see as many collectors going after that stuff. But if you do want to go after that stuff, it is relatively cheaper than these other three big ones I'm talking about. Now, back when the whole retro revival craze started back in, I'd say around 2008 or so, there was really a focus on collecting Nintendo stuff. And this continued for quite a while, up until I'd say probably around when the mini consoles came out. The NES Mini and the Super Nintendo Mini. But once those mini consoles came out, I feel like overall the prices really cooled off on a lot of Nintendo and Super Nintendo games. Later Nintendo stuff is a different story, like the Nintendo GameCube for example. But for Nintendo and Super Nintendo, I saw a lot of prices plateau and in some cases actually come down. And sure, prices for some games are still going up, but my point is things really cooled off once those mini consoles came out, around that time. I think what happened is by that point, everybody who wanted Nintendo and Super Nintendo games had either already collected all the physical copies of games they wanted, or they just resorted to the mini consoles and, maybe hacking them and sticking all the games they'd want to play for the consoles that way, and they were happy with it. But that doesn't mean these collectors were satisfied overall. Oh no, they needed something new to go after, and that something new would be Sega games. I tell ya, collectors are creatures of habit, and that habit is collecting stuff. It's very rare that collectors just look at their collection and go, okay, I'm good. No, there's always something new that's going to interest them. They've developed that habit of being like, okay, this looks cool, I want to get this. That looks cool, I want to get that. So on and so forth. Okay, so I really wanted to focus on the Sega Saturn and Sega Dreamcast because that's where I've really seen prices going up. And some of you might be thinking, well, Sega Saturn and Sega Dreamcast are newer systems than the Super Nintendo and Nintendo, so wouldn't it just make sense that the kids who grew up playing those consoles are now of a similar age that the Nintendo and Super Nintendo people were, a handful of years ago when they started collecting. So they're just at that age where those consoles are popular to collect for. And while that's definitely true, there's certainly a lot of truth to that, and that's a big factor. My counter argument would be, well, Sega Genesis games, the prices for those are going up, and those were the same time as the Nintendo and Super Nintendo. And again, I'm not saying that all Nintendo and Super Nintendo games have had their prices come to a halt. Not at all. I'm just saying I've really seen a shift in the focus go to the Sega side of things. And the Sega Genesis, the prices have been going up more overall in comparison to Super Nintendo. Okay, so let's talk specifically about the Sega Saturn. Now, the Sega Saturn has always been really infamous for having tons of expensive games. And this is because Sega Saturn was not very popular back in the day, but now people have realized it's a great system and they want to collect for it. So they're coming back to the system now to collect some of those great, awesome games that it has. So here's the thing, because these games have always been very limited in supply and very popular, that's only getting worse and worse as time goes on because there's such a small supply of these games. The prices can just keep going up and up pretty dramatically because a lot of the people who have collected these games are like, I'm not giving these up for anything. And sure, there are some people who want to cash in when the prices are high, but for a lot of people, it's a very coveted system and they just don't want to give up those games. So what I've seen happen is that what are considered some of the more common popular games for the system, even these are going way up in price. And these used to be like relatively affordable, and now they're what I'd consider to be expensive games, and it's probably only going to get worse and worse. despite having really high prices, if you go onto eBay or something like that, you can pretty much always at least find some listings of the game available. So maybe it's expensive, but it is possible to buy it. There's listings up there, generally multiple ones. But what I've been seeing for Sega Saturn is some of the games, and even some of the, what I'd say are kind of more common games, at any given time, there's no guarantee that that game is there, that there's even a listing up for it. So of course, when a listing does pop up, you're kind of just at the mercy of whatever the lister, listing the price of the game wants to put it up for. And then, people are so desperate to buy the game because there hasn't been listings for a while that they might just pay it. The Dreamcast is a little different, where you can typically find copies of whatever game you're looking for. But it is a very popular console, and so the prices are still going up. What you got to remember about the Dreamcast is it was really popular even back in the day. Despite being short-lived, it had a really strong cult fan base. So people are always collecting for the Dreamcast. And I think even if perhaps there are more copies of their games to go around than there are for the Sega Saturn, there's also more people collecting the Dreamcast, I'd say, overall. And sure, those high prices of the Sega Saturn games scare a lot of people away, but the Dreamcast, people have always loved the Dreamcast, and so prices just keep going up for it as collectors are going after this stuff, and a lot of them are holding on to it. The Sega Genesis has always been a popular console as well, but like I said earlier, a lot of the people who got to a point they wanted to be at with their Nintendo stuff diverted their attention to the Sega stuff, and Sega Genesis is a big part of Sega's legacy, and so people want to collect those Sega Genesis games. Then there's the Sega CD and Sega 32X add-ons for the Genesis, which, very similar to the Sega Saturn, were not commercially successful, and so there's not a lot of copies around of them, which of course makes them expensive. Not to mention, for the 32X, there really weren't a heck of a lot of games even released for it, so people who are collecting for the 32X are pretty much all competing with each other for a lot of the exact same games. Let me tell a quick little story to demonstrate what's been going on with the prices of Sega Genesis games. Okay, so let's take the game Elemental Master, which is a shoot-'em-up game that not a lot of people know about. It was made by Technosoft, the same people who make the Thunder Force games. Anyways, good game, cool music, all that great stuff. Now, back when I started collecting Sega Genesis games in 2011, that game was roughly like a $10 or $15 game for years and years. It remained fairly close to that price. But then I just checked the other day and was shocked to see that copies of the game have been selling for around $100 each just for the cartridge. That is a crazy price spike. Okay, before I wrap this video up, I do want to quickly go over some of the solutions to avoiding paying these high prices. For the Sega Genesis, you can get an EverDrive cart, which is just a cartridge that you load a bunch of ROMs onto a SD card, stick it in the cartridge, and then stick it in your console, and you've got all the games you could ever want. For the Sega Saturn, there is something called Pseudo Saturn, which is a cartridge that you plug into the system, and then that way you can burn your own discs and play whatever burned games you have. For the Dreamcast, you can just burn games and put them right in there without any modifications to the system or extra add-ons or anything. So there is that. Also for Sega Saturn, the import versions of a lot of games are cheaper and perfectly playable. And of course, last but not least, just don't collect them. Avoid them like the plague, which some people do, unfortunately. Okay, so that does it for some of my thoughts when it comes to Sega collecting, but of course I would love to hear what some of yours are. What are some of the observations you've made when it comes to Sega collecting over the years? And also, what's your personal mindset right now when it comes to collecting these games? Do you have a lot of Sega games? Do you want to collect more? Do the prices deter you from doing so? Do you maybe have some tricks for working your way around the high prices? All of that I'd be really curious to hear. So be sure to leave those comments down below, and I will see ya in the next video.